You're listening to the Renegade Blitz podcast, a podcast for Steelers fans by Steelers fans. Follow us on Twitter at Renegade Blitz, read articles on renegadeblitz.com, and like us on Facebook. With the Super Bowl in the rearview mirror, we're looking forward to the NFL 2021 draft, but we have to have a special interview with a person who's done a book on one of the great figures in Pittsburgh's history. Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the Renegade Blitz. I'm Ty Polk, joined by Chris Ward. Glad to have you here with us, and we've been mentioning his name across some of the interviews that we've had on the Renegade Blitz over the past season, and now that Bill Nunn has finally been inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, we thought of none better time than to have him on. We're joined by the author of The Color of Sundays, the secret strategy that built the Steelers dynasty, Andrew Conte. He's currently the director of the Center for Media Innovation at Point Park University. Andy, thanks for coming on with us, and it's amazing. This time last year, I was producing your podcast, and now you're on one that I host with an old Point Park graduate.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be with you guys. It's such an honor to have two former students reach out to you and say, like, hey, we're doing this thing, and will you be part of it? So I'm glad to be with you guys. It's good to see you. And I would say that the title of that book is a bit of a tongue twister. So you got through it, though.
We talked to Ryan Scarpino, a former PR specialist for the Steelers, in our last podcast, and he told us stories about his first interactions with Bill Nunn. He described them as relatively brief interactions, but he could tell he was an important person in the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers. How much did you know about him before you started writing this book?
I didn't know anything about Nunn from the beginning. I was having lunch with Mark Hart, who's on the business side for the Steelers organization. We were over at the Steelers headquarters, and my book Breakaway about the Penguins had just come out and it was a bestseller. And Mark was like, hey, you should do a book on Bill Nunn. And I was like, who? Never heard of him. And he's like, oh, you got to hear this guy's story. And then he started telling me more and more about it. And I was like, yeah, that's a great story. I really want to do it. And then I tried reaching out to Nunn. I called him, left messages. I sent him a personal handwritten note. He wouldn't return my phone calls. And then I was fortunate. I knew Kevin Colbert a little bit, the general manager. So I reached out to him. I was like, hey, this is what I'm thinking about doing. He's like, that's a great idea. And he leaned on him. And then I knew the ambassador Rooney, Dan Rooney, who was the owner of the team at that point. And I also talked with him, and he also wanted the book. So those two guys reached out to Nunn and convinced him to meet with me the first time. And even when we got together the first time, Nunn was like, you're not doing a book on me. And I was like, it was a negotiation. And he just was so humble. He didn't want an undue share of attention on himself. But in reality, there was a lot that was due to him. And so I was glad that what I convinced him ultimately was that, if we didn't do the story then and we didn't talk about it and I didn't record some interviews with him, that there was a good chance that was going to be lost to history. And I think that ultimately convinced him. And then the other part was that I told him that the book would not be just about him, but it would be about, the whole broader scope of things. And I know some Steelers fans were a little disappointed because I go into a lot of the civil rights history that was going on at the same time in the 1950s and 60s. But for me, that was an essential part of the book. And the other part, before coming to the Steelers, Nunn was a reporter for the Pittsburgh Courier. And in the book, the Courier is almost like a character for big chunks of it because, the Courier, for those who don't know, is at the time, Second World War, after that, it was really the nation's black newspaper. They had bureaus all across the country and did a lot of important work. And it was important for me to include that in the story as well, to show that, what the Courier had been and what Nunn had meant to the Courier as well as the Steelers.
There are many words to describe the book, but perhaps the most impactful word is timely. As you mentioned in the acknowledgements section, some people you talked to in making the book, Earl Lloyd, Bob Wilson, L.C. Greenwood, and Nunn himself died while making your book. How important was getting these stories in, and did any of their passings change the way you wrote The Colors of Sundays?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I for a while, I started to feel like the Grim Reaper. I was like, everyone I talked to, I would do these interviews, and then a few months later, they were dead. Bill Nunn I talked to the day before he suffered a stroke. He was 89 years old. He was still going into work at Steelers headquarters. They were getting ready for the draft that year. I think it was 2014. And talked to him the day before, and he said, I got gotten to the point in my reporting where I needed to know more about his personal life, like how he met his wife, and the fact that they had kids and all these things. And he's like, everybody's born, everybody dies, and half the stuff in between you try to forget. And then the next day he suffered a stroke and then died a week later. And it was hard for me. I don't think I realized until he was gone how much he had come to mean to me, that we had been spending time together talking about his stories and listening to the things that he had accomplished and his perspective on the world. And, we'd become friends. And when he was gone, I set aside the book project for at least 6 months. I just couldn't work on it. But he lived in the Upper Hill district, and there's a big blue water tower that's right across the street from his home. And everywhere I went in the city, if I was in Mount Washington, at that point I was working at the Tribune Review from my office, I could see this blue tower everywhere I went. And it was a reminder to me, like, I needed to finish that story. And I'm so glad that I did. I would say too that Nunn's family they were suspicious of me when he was alive, because they were like, who's this reporter coming around asking questions, spending time with Nunn? They all called him Nunn. Even his wife called him Nunn. Spending time with Nunn in the basement, and because we had a game room. And then when he died, I went to the funeral and paid my respects, and they still were like, who's this guy? And then, a year later or so, I went back to them with the first manuscript. And before I sent it off to my publisher, I showed them the first draft, and they were so grateful that he had told his stories and we had recorded them, and we have a great relationship. His wife, Frances, actually died the day that they found out that he was a finalist for the Hall of Fame. And, but I still talk with his daughter.
There was always a groundswell of support for Nunn's induction into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. With the induction of Donnie Shell last year, it felt like Nunn was on the cusp of finally getting the nod, and it finally happened the night before Super Bowl 55. What are your thoughts on his induction, and have you talked to any members of the Nunn family since the announcement?
Yeah, so I talked to Nunn's daughter, Linnell, it was a couple of days before the announcement, and they were super excited about it. And then we texted back and forth the day after the announcement, and she just, again, they've just been so great about acknowledging the book as a way to preserve and to introduce Nunn's legacy to more people. Shell really epitomizes what makes Nunn so special, because, like you mentioned, he was undrafted free agent, and there were so many players that Nunn found late in the draft, and the thing was, at the time, the NFL, all the teams knew that there were talented players at the historically black colleges and universities, but the white scouts they didn't feel comfortable going on campus. They didn't know how to navigate the campus community. They just didn't understand that world. And, Nunn had already been there for more than 20 years as a reporter for the Courier. And so he really understood, and he was able to see players that the other scouts couldn't see. But the case with Donnie Shell and Sam Davis was another, and Glenn Edwards was I think those are the three undrafted free agents that went on to win 10 Super Bowls among them. And now Donnie Shell's, going into the Hall of Fame, and he'll go in the same time as Nunn, thanks to COVID, the fact that they didn't have the inductions last year. I think it just underscores how important is, because they were these guys that just wouldn't have had a chance to play otherwise.
With the social justice initiatives by the NFL, especially in the Super Bowl, and really over the past year with the death of George Floyd being the turning point, how important is it that Nunn get his honors, especially after these big statements by the NFL and its players?
And you mentioned George Floyd and the racial awareness that's going on in the NFL. We really saw it on Super Bowl Sunday. Before the Super Bowl aired, there were many attempts to take a pause and to be deliberate about talking about race. But the NFL still has a long way to go in terms of getting more diversity. And honestly, when we talk about diversity in the NFL, it's really about black people, right? Getting more black people into the front office, general managers and scouts and owners. And that's something that the NFL still has to work on.
And, it's clear that without Nunn's impact, there would be no Steelers dynasty in the 1970s. The Steelers were perennial losers in the 1960s, and really, for their entire history, since they were created in 1933. And people were starting to know about Nunn's Black College All-American team more at that time in the 60s. So Dan Rooney offered Bill Nunn a job with the Steelers scouting department in 1967, accepted the role as a part-time position, and he was hired full-time in 1969 when Chuck Noll became head coach. What was Nunn's original reaction when Rooney wanted him to join the Steelers?
So the first thing I want to say is that was the only time that Dan Rooney pushed back at me. I said to him, the Steelers were terrible before Nunn came along. He said, we weren't terrible. We were only mediocre. But the reality is they had only been to the playoffs one time before that. And they had lost. But I think in terms of, Nunn's impact at that point, like you were saying, they wouldn't have had those, they wouldn't have had those successes. We wouldn't be talking about the Super Steelers because, he was able to find players that they just couldn't find. But whenever Dan Rooney, what happened was the Courier was having these, the Courier did a Black College All-America team every year. And that was Nunn's job. He traveled like 12,000 miles around the country, identifying these players, watching as many games as he could. And he'd come back and he would compile this list. And then in the 1960s, Nunn got this idea that he would start bringing all those players to Pittsburgh for a big banquet each year. And so it was sponsored by R.C. Cola. And it was held at the Hilton in Pittsburgh, which is now it's something else, but it's right there at the point. And it was this glitzy affair. And one year they had Muhammad Ali came in, and he was in town for something, and he came through, and he came up to the stage, and any of you guys want to take a swing at me? And none of them did. But it was this really big celebrity event, and the Rooneys were and the Steelers were part of sponsoring the event, and the Rooneys realized after several years that they were like, why don't we know about these guys? Like, we don't know these players. And so father and son, Art, the founder of the team, and his son, Dan, got together and said, we should bring this guy in. And so Dan reached out to him, and their offices were at the Roosevelt Hotel in downtown Pittsburgh. It's right across from where Heinz Hall is now. And Nunn came in, and Dan Rooney said, hey, we want to hire you. And Nunn said, no, I'm not interested. You didn't like it when you wouldn't let me sit in the press box when I first started covering the team. You wouldn't let me. You've never asked me for my opinion before. You never paid attention to my picks in the Courier. Not interested. And Dan, to his credit, said, no, we're sincere. We really not only do we want you to come in and scout the black colleges, we want you to just come in and be a scout for all the players. So it wasn't just black players. He was scouting all the schools. And he said, we're really sincere about it, and to convince him. But then Nunn finally, when he made up his mind, said, yeah, I'll take the job, but I need a year to wind things down at the Courier. So instead of 2 weeks notice, he gave him 52 weeks notice.
And without Nunn, the Steelers don't find players like John Stallworth, Mel Blount, L.C. Greenwood, Ernie Holmes, Dwight White, and Donnie Shell, all who played at HBCUs. Stallworth, Blount, and Shell are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It really makes you wonder why he wasn't nominated to the Pro Football Hall of Fame earlier. It's long overdue, but we're really glad that he's finally received this honor.
Part of it was because he was so humble. He didn't go around beating his own chest. The other part is that scouts are sort of invisible, right? Scouts do this role that they travel the country. It's in many ways a thankless kind of job. They're on the road a lot of the time, and they're looking at these players, and what they do is behind the scenes. We see the results of it on draft day. Whenever there's all this fanfare around the players who were selected in the draft, but you never see the scouts behind the scene. I mean, the only thing that you ever get to see is pre-COVID days, you got to see sort of the war rooms that the teams had where they, and so certainly the scouts were in there. And then, of course, this year we saw into people's living rooms, as they were making the picks. But even then, you don't know who those guys are. And so they work in anonymity. I think of the first Steelers Super Bowl, and it was at Tulane Stadium in New Orleans. And it was supposed to be at the Superdome, but the Superdome wasn't done yet. And so they're at Tulane College, and I guess Tulane University, and Nunn's sitting up in the stands. He's sitting up in the bleachers. He's not on the field. He's not part of anything that goes on that day. But of course, everything that happened on the field was a result of the work he had done quietly on his own in the months before, years before.
A few weeks ago, Kevin Colbert was on the WDVE morning show, and he talked about how Nunn just can name drop people like Roberto Clemente, Joe Louis, Jackie Robinson, and entertainers also like Lena Horne. Him being a journalist at the Courier, then do you have any stories about him having interactions with those stars like Clemente, Joe Louis, and Jackie Robinson?
Yeah, for sure. So because Nunn's father had been at the Courier before him. His father was actually the managing editor of the Courier, and his name was also, obviously Bill Nunn. He was Bill Nunn Sr. And, it was at a time when things were segregated because of the Jim Crow laws in the United States. And so when sports figures and entertainers came to Pittsburgh, they couldn't stay in the downtown hotels. They would oftentimes show up in the Hill District. They would turn up at the Courier's offices. Sometimes they would stay with the Nunns in their home. And so Bill Nunn he would come home and these guys would be in his living room. Joe Louis, the boxer, would be there in his living room. And Stephen Fetchit, who was the first Black Hollywood star to make $1 million. These people were just part of his life. And then when Nunn grew up, and continued to live in the Hill District, he became very close with Roberto Clemente. Clemente was in a difficult situation. He'd never thought of himself as Black until he came to, first Canada and then to Pittsburgh. And when he gets here, people will say, well, you're Black. And he's like, oh, I'm Puerto Rican. But of course he spoke Spanish. And so the African-Americans in the United States were like, he's not one of us. He doesn't speak English. He speaks Spanish. And so he was really isolated. And his story, his whole separate story, which I've done a children's book on, but it's really inspirational. I mean, what he did for Latino ball players is amazing. But yeah, Nunn and Clemente became friends, and one of my favorite moments was after the 1960 World Series, and they're in the locker room. Nunn goes in and he sees Clemente in the sort of the corner. Everybody's celebrating. Clemente's just there, like getting dressed. He's like, what's going on? Well, Clemente was upset that he hadn't been named MVP. He'd had a great series, but they didn't pick him. And he was like, because I'm a Spanish-speaking Black man, I didn't get picked. And which, you can make all kinds of arguments about whether that's valid or not. But so he says to Nunn, can you drive me to the airport? And so Nunn's like, yeah, all right. And so they sneak out the back door of the Forbes Field, and Clemente's carrying in his arm a trophy that he got from, he was named the fans MVP for his work throughout the season. And when he walks outside, there are all these fans there, and they mob around him, and they're just, they throng around him. They all want to be close to him. And by the time they get to the car, then it takes them forever to walk down the block to get to the car. And by the time they get there, Clemente's just beaming and, so excited about it. And so, Nunn, as a sports reporter in those days, he had that kind of access, and it wasn't just about having access, but he had real relationships with these people.
You mentioned in your book that Nunn would sleep at the house of a university president or head coach at an HBCU school in the segregated South. What was it like for Nunn traveling in the South at that time? And do you have any stories of the obstacles that he faced? Yeah,
so Nunn was clear to me too that, yes, while he ran into Jim Crow laws and segregation throughout the South, that there was also segregation here in Pittsburgh. And there were lots of things that, he ran into situations where things were segregated here. But, as he traveled throughout the South, there were a couple of things. I mean, one, I said, when you was it difficult? Like you said, sometimes he would end up, he would stay with the college president or the athletic director or the coach. He'd stay in their homes because, like you said, the HBCUs were there and there weren't a lot of hotels, and but he was like, no, it was perfect. Like why would I want anything different to that? There was this whole universe on each of these campuses that was set aside, and it was just a universe for Black people where they could, be careful. They could do their own thing and not have to worry about dealing with the racist whites that they would encounter outside of that. He talked about just, all the things that you hear about, the terrible things about traveling through the South, at that time, and being stuck, on buses and falling asleep. And just, to me, it was remarkable. Like, not only did he travel so far, but he did it at a time and at a place when he was under duress the whole time.
And Nunn was an inaugural member of the Black College Hall of Fame or Black College Football Hall of Fame in 2010, with names like Jerry Rice, Walter Payton, and legendary Grambling State University head coach Eddie Robinson. Do you think that's when people really started to know about Nunn's story? It seems like over the last 10 years, people started to really know about him more thanks to your book and some Steeler beat writers, and Jim Trotter, who has been a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame Selection Committee since 2007 and is currently the president of the Pro Football Writers of America.
I feel like the people who knew were the ones who, they've always known about Nunn. The guys who are intimately involved with football, who knew football, certainly knew about, the people who had come up through the Black colleges. They knew the impact of Nunn as a reporter and as a scout. It's just the rest of us, the rest of us as Steelers fans, waking up to his story, and, people who are like a step or two removed from football. And thanks for saying that. One of the joys for me has been, sharing his story to a wider audience.
Jim Rooney outlines in his book on his dad, Dan Rooney, how the Steelers failed to draft an HBCU player in the 2 years before Nunn joined the club full-time in 1969, but selected a total of 14 over the next 3 years. From 1969 through 1975, the Steelers drafted 25 players from HBCUs, more than any other NFL club and twice the league average per Rooney. Can you talk about, the Steelers players on that team, and most of them from all Black colleges in the South, and it seemed like they really trusted Nunn, like the Donnie Shell story. Like he was undrafted free agent, and he was told by his college coach to go to the Steelers because of Nunn.
Yeah, I think the story that comes to my mind, there are a couple, but one is the story of Elsie Greenwood, which we kind of hinted at before. He's drafted the same year as Mean Joe Green. They both become, half of the Steelers' front four steel curtain defense, and while, everybody knew that Joe Green was going to be a star. He was picked 4th overall. He went to not an HBCU, but Elsie Greenwood was picked like 200 something. He was way back in the draft. People didn't know who he was, and that just epitomizes the impact that Nunn was able to have to find these guys. And like you talked about, when you go back and you look at the numbers of the Super Bowl winning teams that they had, the percentages of players that that were Black players on the team was significant. And then among the Black players, a big chunk of them had come from HBCUs. And so, that's really when you start to get a measure of Nunn's success, is when you look at those kinds of figures.
Oh, okay. Speaking back, Culver on the WWE morning show a few weeks ago, he mentioned that Nunn was so much more than just the HBCU guy. That was especially no doubt, but Nunn could go into any college. He mentioned USC, Michigan, Ohio State, and sit in and evaluate players and talk to coaches as if he was sitting in his living room or in his office. And Culver mentioned that he was unique in that manner. And I want to know, do you think his career as a journalist helped him become such a great scout and evaluator?
I'm sure it was significant, his role as a journalist. The other part was that he had a way of seeing sort of each man's spirit. When most scouts go out, they're looking at just the numbers, and they're trying to figure out how fast does he run the 40 and how high can he jump and all these things. And Nunn, he certainly relied on that. But in addition to that, he also tried to measure a man's character and his heart. And that was the thing that stood out. And it was also the thing that he was concerned about, with scouts now, is that there's kind of an echo chamber around, these players. When Nunn was scouting, oftentimes he'd go out on the road for, 10 days, and he would just be gone. And he'd be by himself, and he would have, obviously didn't have the internet, didn't have a cell phone. Maybe would check in with his office and his wife, maybe wouldn't, and he was just out there looking at these players and trying to evaluate them on his own. And what happens now is that, the scouts are out there and they're evaluating these players, but they're also hearing at the same time, who's got this person on their draft list here, and who's got this and who's got that. And it's harder to identify those players. But the challenge is, finding people like, Tom Brady, 6th round quarterback, right? That, stands out that, and he went to a big school. It wasn't like it was a big secret. But, every team passed on him at least 5 times.
With you writing this story, it feels like this is a question we have to ask you. Do you plan on going to Canton when Nunn gets inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame this August?
It's going to be a big weekend for the Steelers, right? I mean, you got Steelers playing the Cowboys in the preseason game. You got Coach Cowher going in, Troy Polamalu. Who else? I'm going to miss some of them. Nunn's going in, of course. Donnie Shell and
Faneca.
Alan Faneca, yeah. So it's going to be a big Steelers weekend in Canton, and I would love to be there. We'll have to see. I haven't got my plans together yet, but should be a big time for Steelers fans.
We'll get you out to Canton. We'll start a hashtag or something. Hashtag get Andy to Canton.
That'd be an awesome road trip, I think. Yeah, the 3 of us. Just I'll stand out in my driveway and wait for Chris to pull up in his car, and we'll go. So.
And Andy, once again, we led off with the interview talking about how I did podcasts for you. We really want to thank you for kind of being, I guess, in a way, like the groundwork for this podcast, working on that stuff in the pandemic with, from Among Neighbors all the way out to planned podcasts with, the Healing Center and other things like that. Doing this stuff, like doing it off of Zoom, it was built off of those last couple months at the CMI. So again, thank you so much for everything that you do. Thank you for also being our teacher in Point Park whenever we were coming up.
I just want to say sincerely, I'm proud of both you guys. I mean, you both were. I think you're grinders. When you were in my classes at Point Park University, you stood out for putting in hard work. I could think of instances for both of you where you had moments that you made real progress. You put in the work to be there, and so I'm really proud of you for grinding it out now, figuring this out, doing this podcast, keeping it going, making sure you're still telling stories. No one's going to stop you from doing it, and whatever I can do to support you and be in your corner, please let me know.
Absolutely, and that's Andrew Conte, the author of The Color of Sundays, The Secret Strategy That Built the Steelers Dynasty, and also the director of the Center for Media Innovation at Point Park University. Follow him on Twitter at Andrew Conte. And of course, be sure to buy The Color of Sundays on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere else you can find books. Andy, thanks for coming on the show again.
You're welcome, anytime.
And as the offseason continues to roll on, the Renegade Blitz will cover all news in terms of free agency and what's coming up with the draft or the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's all for us now. For Chris Ward, I'm Ty Polk. Thank you for tuning in to the Renegade Blitz. Thank you for listening to the Renegade Blitz podcast. Follow us on Twitter at Renegade Blitz, read articles on renegadeblitz.com, and like us on Facebook. Our podcast is available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, YouTube, iHeart, and Spotify.